Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this mini TNT show. It's mini in time. We're here for only 30 minutes tonight, but it's maxi in almost every other respect, because we'll be talking about food sovereignty. What is food sovereignty? Well, we're going to help define that for you. And I think once we've done that and discussed other aspects of this hugely important topic, I hope and I expect you'll find this one of those areas where, having got to know about it, you probably want to know more about it. And we've got some news in that regard at the end of the show. So, without any further ado, we're going to do what the UK government never does. We're going to talk to somebody who actually knows about the subject. We're going to be talking to Ruth Watson, who is a journalist and helped to, was the founder of Keep Scotland the Brand, and has been an activist in many areas and aspects of the food industry. So no one better, in fact, to talk about food sovereignty. Ruth, hello, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me on the show.
It's a great pleasure. Can we talk, first of all, what the term food sovereignty means?
Well, food sovereignty is when the producers and those people, the growers, have control over the system of food, between getting the food to our tables, rather than it pretty much being in the hands of large corporations and sort of big business. So it's really sort of bringing it not back to the way it was in medieval times, but giving people a lot more agency, because obviously you have to have you have to have ways of getting food to people's shelves, and you can't just have it that people are sort of standing at street corners hawking their wares or at village markets again, because that's not the way that we are. But food sovereignty is about making sure that the growers have agency and autonomy within the system.
Say, just for the sake of illustration, to give people a chance to get their hands around this, say, for example, Scotland had food sovereignty right now. What differences or changes would people see from that status to the one that exists just now?
Well, there's different ways it can be done. And while you were very gracious in your introduction to me, I have to say there are many people who are way more qualified than I am to speak about this, but I'm conversant with many of the issues. So, for example, I lived in Western Australia for a while, and there is a man there called Tony Galati, who is a gentleman with a legendary monobrow, and he's a tatty farmer, and there are 3 big supermarkets in Western Australia. It's actually very similar to what it's like over here. And one day, he's a tatty farmer, and one day, as happens over here, the supermarket phoned up and said, could you dig up a field of tatties and we'll pick up the crates from you tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, we want them, and this is the price we're going to pay for them.
Yeah.
And they turned up the next morning. He'd worked all night, got extra people in, to do the work. And they turned up and went, that's great, tatties all look fantastic, but we're going to pay you half what we agreed on the phone. And I've heard this over here. I've heard this with farmers, exactly the same situation, because they know, the supermarkets know, the buyer knows that once you've picked the stuff, what can you do with it? It's just going to rot if you don't have a market. So they often kind of basically, do a trump and change the deal at the last minute, and it's appalling. But Tony Galati, being a guy with a good pair of cojones, he went, nah. Being an Australian, he said something which I won't repeat on the station, and he went out and he set up his own supermarket chain, but he did it in such a way that the farmers that participate in it have a degree of autonomy. So I think that probably what he has done is a good example of what modern food sovereignty can look like in the conurbations and in the cities. So he developed a supermarket which takes produce from local farmers. So it's kind of like a farmer's market within, and they use barcodes so that to control who gets what from the sales. So there's you can have in a place called Margaret River. There's a beautiful place called Margaret River in the west coast of Australia, and they did the most amazing cheese, but it was this artisan cheesemaker, and you couldn't get this cheese anywhere else. And so if I knew people were going down that direction, I would get them to pop into the spud shed at this place, because what happens over here is if you've got a really good idea and a really nice artisan cheese, and one of the supermarkets, you manage to get it on their shelves, then you think that's brilliant, my problems are solved, I'm going big. But then what happens is the supermarket says, well, you have to be able to provide all of our shops, and you have to be able to provide all of our shops with a certain quantity. And then so people end up borrowing, and they kind of expand too fast, and the product suffers, and actually it stops being what people wanted it to be. And then, as we saw with I've got total brain fog. The name of the fish company over on near Lockerbie, that was shut down. Then you get big. You rely on one customer, and then they pull out because they can get it cheaper somewhere else, and then you go bust. So
I gather one of the founding principles of food sovereignty is that food is to be regarded as a right, not a commodity. In other words, that it would be the right of every individual and every community to define their own food and agricultural systems to provide healthy and culturally appropriate food.
Yes, I mean, I think that you do. I think that you can go. I think you do have to be very careful, because any food sovereignty system that you have still has to be capable of feeding your community and your people. You don't want to go full North Korean on you know what I mean? It's you can have a brilliant idea, but then if you get a bad summer, and like this summer, I'm so angry about food poverty and food insecurity in this country that I've started a community garden in my local community, and the green beans they look blanched. We've had a lot of failures because of the weather this year. And so there's an interdependency if we don't want to have famine. We can't forget the last famine, if I'm correct, the last famine that we had in Scotland was in Orkney, and I think it was 1902 or it was actually really relatively recently. So, we can't forget that you have to, food sovereignty makes sense, but it has to have, you have to join the dots so that no one area is running the risk of being without or suffering from want.
I mean, you raise a very good point, because I think if people are hearing about this for the first time, I think their initial reaction will be very positive. Particularly people of an independence bent who will be thinking to themselves, well, if we're going to have sovereignty, why don't we have food sovereignty? That makes so much sense. However, the point you just made seems to me to be important, which is what happens having secured food sovereignty if you have some sort of horrible problem like the climate or the weather, and all of a sudden, you don't, all that food sovereignty has just gone. Because you've had such a bad harvest. Then you have to go to some other country and try and persuade them to sell you food.
So I think that's the joined up thinking bit of it. I think that aspiring to have food sovereignty and working to a system which actually has more justice within it is absolutely the way we should be. And obviously, farmers want to farm and they want to produce. So if we have surplus and that gets sold, and you also sell for markets overseas as well. And obviously, Brexit being the way it is, especially with phase 2 coming in at the end of October, we're going to see a lot of our farming and fishing community without a market easily to sell to. And I think that actually food sovereignty is extremely important, even more so at the moment from an economic point of view, because we need to find ways to support our food and drink producers, because with the new legislation coming in because of Brexit, which of course Scotland did not vote for, then we really face the risk of our food and drink producers being put out of business. Yeah. So one of the things, for example, about food sovereignty is I was speaking to some dairy farmers who pay into a UK-wide cooperative. I actually think they pay about a third of the fees that go into this cooperative, or the overall funds that are in this cooperative. And I was asking this gentleman who's a dairy representative why it was Scotland's dairies were, the big dairies were being run down, and there's the northeast of Scotland, which has been a home of dairy for thousands of years, might lose its dairy farms. We're sort of down to 14 big dairy farms. And he said, well, the infrastructure was not supported by this dairy cooperative. And so they ran it down while developing a new one in the Lake District and one in Wales. So that's why we see Scottish cheese that sort of, produced in England, made from Scottish milk, is because that factory, that processing plant has gone. Now, in that, you end up with a massive vulnerability. But then I was speaking to other dairy farmers who are saying, well, actually, the way that we get around that is that we've started selling to our local communities, and we're selling in milk bottles, and we're delivering to the door. And then you've got the Food for Life Served Here scheme, which the Scottish government is I think it's a visionary, common sense piece of legislation, or piece of support, where they encourage local councils to buy within their community. So Mossgiel Farm, which is an organic farm, which is an ethical dairy, which does really, really remarkably good stuff with the cattle, Robbie Burns' old farm, they are now serving all the children in their community with organic milk in glass bottles. Now that is food sovereignty in action. So, it's I think there's a lot to be said for having something. I've spoken to the NFU in the past and said, would you think of doing something like the Spud Shack, where, you can still go in and buy your toilet rolls and your tins of beans and your tins of tomatoes, but you're getting food from local producers on the shelves through barcodes. And I can't see the supermarkets wanting to do that, but I could see that being something which could be, community supermarkets are actually quite a big thing in Germany, for example, and over in the States. So I think with things like that, as long as we need to make it easy for people to access food.
Yep.
And I think in terms of having the right to food, I'm very much in favour of the Good Food Nation bill. I would like to see it become a Good Food Nation Act, much more dilly-dallying, where any legislation being considered has to take into account the people's right to food. So for example, a Good Food Nation Act should mean that you could never have horrific, ghastly, punitive universal credit, punitive policies like that, which would force people into poverty.
Yeah.
And food insecurity. So there's a lot to be positive about, and the very fact that people know about food sovereignty or are interested in it, I think, is a very good move. But we have the beginnings of it, and organisations like Scotland Food and Drink are working extremely hard to try and sort of join the dots and sort of have that farm to fork connection.
That's good news, because I suspect there'll be a lot of people who've seen the pictures, if they haven't personally experienced empty shelves. They've gone to a supermarket, maybe their regular supermarket, and they've been astonished at the empty shelves. Now, the line, in inverted commas, that the UK government produced to explain this away is that COVID had affected lots of drivers, and therefore, since the drivers weren't around, it was impossible to get the food actually to the outlets. Most of the food producers have come back and said, well, that's just not so. The situation is, frankly, that we just can't get the food. We can't get it into the ports from elsewhere because the UK is not self-sufficient in food. You can't grow bananas here, and you can't grow oranges successfully. Wine is a bit of a problem, except for the southeast of England. So there's a whole raft of areas where you need to import food. But I suspect maybe more people will be sympathetic to the whole idea of food sovereignty once they've seen these pictures of empty shelves, because they'll be saying to themselves, well, I on my trip, perhaps they might be thinking, to the supermarket, I passed a number of fields in my local area where the farmers are working flat out to grow potatoes and oats and barley and wheat, all the rest of it. it would make more sense they'll be thinking to themselves, I suspect, increasingly, why don't we just take the food that's available locally and take it somewhere? If the supermarkets are wedded to their old model of shipping a packet of biscuits from Edinburgh to Milton Keynes and back up again, there's no reason why the rest of us should put up with that nonsense. Let's get the food direct. I think you might find with the whole food sovereignty matter and issue that you might be pushing against an open door here.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a question come in asking about free school milk, and I mean, the point is that through local procurement, which local councils can do, they have a huge chunk of money that they can make sure gives our school children decent, fresh, locally cooked food. So in Shetland, for example, I think 96% of their food and drink comes from local producers, so that they're not having to rely on the ferries coming over. The Mossgiel Dairy example, they are delivering fresh every morning organic milk in glass bottles to schools for the children. So the Scottish Government is doing a huge amount to support local councils, but of course the local councils are the ones who make those choices. But there's a lot to be said. I mean, when you talk about, I can't remember how much it is, it was like 47 pence, 49 pence that council spend on a child's school lunch, getting, rolls that could last for 3 weeks shipped up from Breaks Brothers. Now, Breaks Brothers and the supermarkets aren't the bad guys. They've just got a business model, and we're accommodating that. So I think that we have got significant issues in terms of making political choices. The political choices, it's up to us, the voters, to pressure our councils to make the choices to make sure that our children and those people in our institutions, whether they be prisons or old folks' homes or hospitals, get fed the very best that Scotland has to offer. In terms of food security and feeding ourselves, Scotland can, as a nation, can feed ourselves, but we'd be going back to neeps and oats and lamb. Yeah. Now that there may well be many farmers that would love to see us go back to eating oats and neeps and lamb, but I suspect that most of us aren't ready to go back to the diet of our forebears. So it's
What is the difference between food sovereignty and food security?
To be honest, I think that one comes from the other. That may not be the dictionary definition, but in my personal view, I mean, the first duty of any government is to feed its people, and so food security and food sovereignty go hand in hand. When you think about it, the big dairies. I spoke to Robert Graham of Graham Dairy, Robert Graham Jr. of Graham's Dairies, and I'm pretty sure that he told me that it was 1 pence that he gets from every litre of milk that he sells, because it's a loss leader. The supermarkets have so little, give back so little. Now, when you think about, I mean, how much milk does that man send to the supermarkets in a day? And even with all of his marketing might and the bulk and all the rest of it, 1 pence. And I mean, all these punts of fruit that farmers produce, and very often we can't see where it comes from, and very often it's very badly labelled, and as many of you will know, I have great issue with that. I think Scotland's food and drink should be labelled clearly so that we can make the choices to what we buy, and we can support local, and we can make carbon footprint choices, and all sorts of really positive things to do with Scotland's brand. But what many people don't understand is if that fruit doesn't sell, the farmer doesn't get paid. And that, to me, it's appalling. And that's why I'm so interested when I was told that there was this food sovereignty week being done by you guys. I was so keen to support it because that is not sustainable. How can that be sustainable for farmers to produce a high quality product and then be held ransom by a supermarket that isn't doing it out of the goodness of their heart? I mean, local supermarkets can, our local supermarkets, brilliant. We get the surplus food that they don't sell coming to our food bank. Now, the very fact we have to have a food bank in a country as rich as ours is something which literally gives me nightmares at night sometimes. It is horrific. So there are many things that I think we can address through food sovereignty, and I know that people like Pete Ritchie of Nourish Scotland and many others organisations spend every day working to try and persuade the Scottish Government to make the Good Food Nation bill, pass it into legislation.
Well,
But
I
of
hope they're
course,
successful because, I'll try and summarise the point you just made, because it seems to me it's terribly, terribly important. Because essentially your point is, well, food security is one thing. Yeah, and obviously we want food security. That's a desirable end. But it's not enough, because a lot of the food that's supplied that we eat and consume is in the thrall to large corporations who are well rewarded and subsidized in many cases, perhaps unlike the local milk supplier and butter supplier that you mentioned. So food security would leave that system completely unaltered, whereas food sovereignty would seek to change the way, not just provide food security, but in addition, change the model by which food is actually grown, distributed, and becomes available to people. So there's a much more closer relationship between the producers and the actual consumers. Because one of the feelings I have when I go to a supermarket, frankly, Ruth, is, I could be anyone. It's like there's a complete disconnect almost between me and the person who produced the cheese or the butter or the milk. I may recognize the brand, but that's as far as it goes.
Yeah, and I think that there are some countries that make things very different. I mean, in France, for example, God love the French and their ability to, take revolution to the streets. It's the farmers. The farmers in France would not have stood for a fraction of what our farmers have put up with. But then they had a revolution years ago, and we've still got a post-feudal system, which is only barely post. And in France, the farmers actually have got serious political clout. That they're kind of like involved in the decision making in a lot of the mayoralities, and so a lot of the supermarkets, or at least this is the way it used to be. Things may have changed since I was speaking to farmers or people there last, but the supermarkets, they can sell. Obviously, they sell lots of everything, but they also have fresh markets in their car parks for fresh food and veg. And buying from local bakers is much more a thing. And so I think that a lot of the time, actually, what we need to do is to have our councils look again at the sort of planning consent that was given for the supermarket. I mean, I know that our local supermarket, they're nice folk, but their planning consent was basically to sell sort of tinned goods. And even in the time since I moved back, they've sort of added a little fresh baked section into it, which has hit our local bakery shop, and they've sort of sneaked a few flowers in, which put one of the flower sellers out of business. And now they've started selling garden produce. Well, it doesn't take much before this behemoth suddenly appears, and you can't get what you want, and they control everything. So I do think that in terms of sovereignty and diversity, we really need to have a conversation about the kind of country we want to live in. And actually, I think that entrepreneurial spirit would be much more rewarded if the sort of the monopoly really. And you can't lose sight of the fact that the supermarkets do talk to each other. They're not supposed to be doing price rigging, but they kind of do. And it's not lost on anybody really that the heads of all the supermarkets were seen going into the doors of number 10 before Brexit. And you're talking about shortages on the shelves. My local supermarket, they were telling me that they had never had such stock in before Brexit happened, because they were so concerned about food security. And now there is nothing. Their storeroom is practically empty, and this is being replicated across Scotland. And it concerns me greatly, for example, that the tatty sorting plant in Carnoustie, Strathmore produces huge amounts of our potatoes, and the tatties there. That plant is being closed, and the potatoes are all going to be sent to Manchester to be graded and sorted and sent back. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's centralisation, and it's rationalising, sort of centralising everything for economy. But a cynic might suggest that if you are a government thinking that your nation might be about to face food shortages, you might want to centralise the food so that those people in small communities that are less likely to riot and do something of significance, you kind of want to have the food all going to somewhere like Manchester and Birmingham, so that the big conurbation, the big sort of urban centres are fed first. And I know that my brother in Cambridge, they never had an empty shelf during the first sort of COVID outbreak, the first lockdown. Whereas if we didn't have local resilience within our community because people started buying from farmers and the butchers were feeding the grannies up the glens, then it could have been really, really bad. So, and I'm seeing questions coming in about Scottish government supporting Scottish butchers, and I mean, actually, the Scottish government just last year put £200,000 into a marketing campaign to support Scotch lamb, or PGI Scotch lamb, and I mean, I'm not here to be a spokesperson for the Scottish government, but actually, many in the farming and food and drink communities have got a lot of praise for the way in which the Scottish government is actively working to try and connect the farm and the fork, and to support our local food and drink producers. They've been extremely proactive, and I spend a lot of time sort of nerding out on various food and drink pages, and that it is discussed and Right. I mean, even today, one of our local MSPs and our cabinet minister, Secretary Mari Gudjon, declared a sort of farming support grant and loans, which is going to make a huge difference, because many of the local farmers, because it's kind of like the system that we have with our farmers and our supermarkets is kind of like the Jeff Bezos and universal credit, and for it's kind of like we've created, or the government in Westminster has created, these massively successful millionaires that don't really have to pay any taxes, and yet they don't pay great wages, and so we subsidize them through our taxes. We subsidize the workers through our taxes who get paid universal credit, and yet somehow the millionaires who are sort of using smart accounting to dodge paying their dues are lauded as being successful, and those people who are paying through our salaries, aren't people aren't being paid proper living wages, and
Ruth,
that's what's happening with our food and drink. The farmers are not getting paid enough.
Sorry to interrupt. We're almost out of time. And is there any last message that you would like to give the audience tonight? What thought would you like to leave them with in a couple of sentences?
If you can afford to, check out your local food boxes, check out farm veg box schemes, and if you can support local, then if you can support and shop local, then do. Lots of people don't have that choice because of availability or cost, but if we can see it, we can buy it and support it. So I would always say, if you can, keep Scotland the brand.
So what would you recommend for people who live in urban areas in the middle of towns and cities who don't have the opportunity to work with the local farmer or drop in a farm shop? What should they do?
The thing is, actually in Scotland, I think the statistic is we're never more than 7 miles from a farm, which is a wonderful fact. Most veg box schemes, most towns and cities have got a farm veg box scheme that will deliver local produce to you. Although my veg box scheme, I get local produce, but I also get pineapples from definitely not from Angus. But there's actually nothing wrong with going to your Lidl or your Aldi or your Tesco's or your Morrison's or your Asda, because local farmers sell in those outlets. But if you can, then support your local farms, and actually at the same time, I would suggest that people get a bit active with their pens and write letters or emails to shop managers and to HQs and explain why we need to support farmers and fishers and to our food and drink producers, and actually perhaps speak to our communities and our elected representatives, and get involved with trying to make political change as well as economic change. But every time you open your purse, you cast a ballot. So vote wisely.
Yeah. And keep Scotland a brand. Ruth, thanks very much. Now, I know you're not terribly well just now, so we deeply appreciate you giving up the time to join us tonight. It's been exceptional. I've learned a lot, and I suspect the audience has too. So there's lots of things. Food sovereignty is hugely important. That's the first thing. Secondly, there's lots of stuff that you can do. And thirdly, support the whole concept if you can through writing to your elected representatives, as Ruth has said, and doing what you can to buy locally. Thank you very much for watching tonight. Take care, and a big thank you again to Ruth.
Thank you for
Good
having
night,
me.
everyone.